At UNIDIR, we're keen to foster discussion around nuclear disarmament and to bring a variety of perspectives and approaches into the discussion. I think this is particularly important in the run-up to the postponed NPT Review Conference. At this event, we're going to concentrate on the Stockholm Initiative and look at the scope for progress with the stepping stones ahead of the NPT Review Conference. Further details of this initiative can be found in the link in the chat, which my colleague will circulate shortly if it's not already there. But to provide some more background on this initiative, I want to hand the floor to Mr. Robert Siegfried to provide a little bit of context first of all. Mr. Siegfried is head of the Division for Nuclear Disarmament, Arms Control and Related Strategic Issues within the German Federal Foreign Office. Mr. Siegfried, thank you for joining us here. You have the floor, sir.
Thanks, James. Dear colleagues, excellencies, I'm honored to speak at the outset of this event. First, I want to thank UNIDIR as the organizer. UNIDIR is more important than ever as a provider of ideas in the disarmament area and as a convener of events such as this. I'm expressing my gratefulness on behalf of Germany and Sweden, the coordinators of the Stockholm Initiative, which was started in 2019 to advance nuclear disarmament by advocating for concrete, realistic steps towards this goal. As you know, a set of 22 stepping stones was agreed in 2020 by the foreign ministers of the 16 member states of the initiative. The last ministerial meeting took place in Amman in January 2021 and reinforced the call for concrete steps. It is planned that ministers meet again before the NPT RevCon. I would like to make reference to German Foreign Minister Maas' statement at the conference on disarmament a few weeks ago. He said that 2021 can be a watershed year for arms control. Indeed, with the political developments of the last months, we see the chance to reverse the negative trend of the past years, that is, erosion of arms control regimes, the backtracking on commitments, the ever-growing polarization. And in particular, I want to underline the necessity for the world to get back on track for nuclear disarmament in 2021. We have seen some positive developments in the past weeks. New START has been extended. This is an important step which was called for by the Stockholm Initiative since 2019, and it is a promising start of the year. We are convinced that the other 21 proposals, the stepping stones, offer a comprehensive menu for much needed progress. Today's discussion provides an opportunity to assess progress and prospects on various of these stepping stones and to elaborate on emerging topics like nuclear risk reduction. I would like to welcome participation of Malaysia as chair of the main committee 1 of the NPT RevCon, whose work the Stockholm Initiative is resolved to support. And I would also like to welcome notably the participation of representatives from nuclear weapon states who bear special responsibility with regard to nuclear disarmament. The Stockholm Initiative underscores the expectation of non-nuclear weapon states towards nuclear disarmament by nuclear weapon states. It also underscores the readiness of non-nuclear weapon states to engage and to contribute to the process. We are satisfied that the initiative helped to regenerate interest in nuclear disarmament in the past 2 years. I would at this occasion like to recall the invitation to align with the Berlin documents that were agreed by the members of the initiative in February 2020. That is this ministerial declaration and the annex containing the stepping stones. With that, I wish you a lively and fruitful discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Indeed, thank you for your kind words on UNIDIR. Without further ado, I'd like to move into the first panel. I think in the case of both sessions today, this will be based around a moderated conversation. So this will begin with some questions to each panelist from me before we will open up the floor to a virtual Q&A. We are quite constrained for time, so rather than take oral questions and comments, I would invite those of you in the audience to use the Q&A function to submit written questions. The panelists will be able to see your questions, but other members of the audience will not. Just so you're aware, I will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we can make no guarantees as we have limited time. So to the first panel, this is going to explore the stepping stones in the current strategic context and the potential of these concrete steps to contribute to realizing action on, amongst other things, political declarations, changes in nuclear policy, dialogue and arms control. And to do this, we have 4 excellent speakers. Further details can be found online, but I want to provide the briefest of introductions. First, if I may turn to you, Andrei. Andrei Buklitsky is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Advanced American Studies at the MGIMO University of the Russian Foreign Ministry. He is also a consultant at the Peer Center as well. Thomas Countryman is currently Chairman of the Board of the Arms Control Association. Prior to assuming this position, he was acting Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security in the US under President Obama. Third, Dr. Wakana Makai is Assistant Professor at the Faculty of International Relations at Asia University and has written around issues of nuclear disarmament. And the fourth in my list is Amir Hamza Mohd Nazir, who is First Secretary of the Permanent Mission of Malaysia to the United Nations. All four panelists, and indeed all speakers in both sessions, will be speaking in their personal capacity. And with that in mind, I'd like to move to the first set of questions. And this one, if I can direct this one to you first, Tom. This links to the first stepping stone on the need to ensure that nuclear weapons will never be used again. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about the importance of reaffirming Reagan-Gorbachev statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But if I could turn to you, Tom, why hasn't this happened yet? Is there value in today's environment into restarting or updating this sort of statement? And is this something achievable in advance of the review conference? Over to you, Tom.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. The answer as to why it didn't happen under the Trump administration has many possible answers. Let me skip over those and simply say you should expect it to happen under the Biden administration. It is something that Mr. Biden believes. It is something that the key people he has appointed to the State Department and the White House believe. And I think that you will see the administration looking for the best opportunity to make such a statement, whether it is unilaterally or bilaterally with Russia or as a P5 statement. In a sense, it is the easiest of the stepping stones. It is not only self-evident, it is something that the leadership of the 5 nuclear weapon states all profess to believe. So you should expect it to happen. What we should be looking for and hoping for, and I want to expect from the Biden administration, is additional steps to devalue nuclear weapons. The stepping stones talks about reducing the salience of nuclear weapons. I like to talk about devaluing nuclear weapons, reducing their role in the defense and deterrence policy of the United States, devaluing them in terms of the defense budget, the massive defense budget of the United States, and reducing the significance of nuclear weapons as a symbol of national prestige and power. Mr. Biden can do all of those things in the direction that he gives to his administration. And those are the directions that I hope the advocates of the stepping stones are engaging with the United States to take over the next few months. It is, as usual in the US, a slow start to the administration. They are not able to implement all of their priorities at once, but that's exactly why at this moment, the advocates of the stepping stones need to be engaging with US leadership at the highest levels they are able to attain within the North Atlantic Council, within the United Nations, in order to make the important messages of the stepping stones heard and get them reflected in the first pronouncements about nuclear policy by the new administration.
Okay, thank you very much. I think quite a strong start to the discussion in this panel. If I can turn to you, Andrei, I'd be interested in getting your views on the Reagan-Gorbachev statement as well at some point, but I also had a specific question I'd like to ask you related to the extension of New START. Now, as Robert pointed out in the opening remarks, New START has been extended, but given the recent experiences with INF, with Open Skies, surely this gives us some pause for thought. So how do we ensure it is in states' best interests to keep these agreements in place? And over to you, Andrei.
Thanks, and first of all, thanks for having me. On Reagan Gorbachev, really briefly, Russia has proposed to reaffirm the statement both bilaterally to the US and multilaterally in the P5 context. So US under the previous administration wasn't very keen on this. President Biden during his campaign endorsed the statement, so I hope we'll be able to get it reaffirmed by this summer's RevCon. On the New START extension, it was not only important in itself, though it was important, but as a sign that any kind of progress really at all is possible in the US-Russian arms control. The last success story before it was New START negotiations, which was more than a decade ago. Since then, the only things we had were worsening relations, mutual accusations of non-compliance, and withdrawals from the treaties. And under such conditions, it was sometimes even hard to speak in support of arms control, which was seen as something outdated, falling apart, and frankly depressing. So to your question more specifically, we are probably not going to get back to the Open Skies Treaty or the INF Treaty, but it is worth revisiting what real-world problems were those treaties trying to address and which of those still apply. So on the INF front, it seems that the US is bent to have INF range systems in the Pacific to counter China, so that will most probably happen. However, it seems that neither the United States, nor Russia, nor the Europeans are interested in a missile standoff in Europe, which leaves hope for agreeing on some sort of non-deployment arrangement there. Moscow has proposed a moratorium specifically to this effect, and also agreed to include the 9M729 missile, which started the whole INF crisis, in this moratorium, which is, in my view, a strong move. And I really hope that US and European countries will engage with the proposal on its merits. In a broader context, I still believe that arms control is a valuable tool of managing military competition and has a lot of potential. So having a security-based discussion, what is it we are trying to solve and why?
I think the connection's dropped, Andre. Okay, perhaps if we can return back, because I think your connection's dropped, Andre.
Given arms
Sorry,
control.
please proceed.
Yes, that a given arms control arrangement is in their security interests and be ready to actively support it instead of playing alliance politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. I think some of your statement was cut out at that point, but I'll come back to you on that. If I could turn to Dr. Wakana Mukai now. Another one of the stepping stones refers to nuclear weapon states taking practical measures to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their policies and their doctrines. Japan has long had to balance its need for deterrence with a longer-term goal of disarmament. And I wonder if you could talk about what this experience teaches us about the conditions necessary for nuclear weapon states to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, and this wider sort of insights you can provide in that balancing process. Dr. Mukai, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your excellent question. One of the most simplest, but I think important plus rather complicated message that this stone implies is that there are still many countries, not just nuclear weapon states, but also countries, including Japan, that considers nuclear deterrence as an important part of their security policy. The necessary conditions for nuclear weapon states to reduce the role of their nuclear weapons can be thought from, I believe, two viewpoints. One is that conditions must be met amongst the nuclear weapon states themselves and also the 4 remaining nuclear possessing states, which are outside of the NPT. This also means that whatever and however the non-nuclear weapon states argue and require nuclear weapon states to move forward towards disarmament, it is ultimately really up to the nuclear weapon states to actually decide and move forward in that direction. And so it is probably not enough, or shall I say, there are unfortunately limits in terms of non-nuclear weapon states requiring certain policies to change towards nuclear weapon states, as many of the stones refer to. But I'm not saying that these messages are meaningless. But on the contrary, I think it is absolutely important to reaffirm our concerns and requests towards the nuclear weapon states in terms of how they are expected to act regarding nuclear disarmament. But on the other hand, it is not enough, or in a more severe tone, I think nuclear weapon states will not act unless they are convinced that the role of nuclear weapons can be reduced. And this, first and foremost, is up to the relations between the nuclear weapon states and the strategic balance amongst themselves. Having said so, however, the other viewpoint would be how non-nuclear weapon states, especially the so-called umbrella states or the nuclear allied states, see nuclear weapons in terms of their security policy. And also related to this is the relation between these states and certain nuclear weapon states. It is not enough for non-nuclear weapon states to simply request certain conditions to be met by nuclear possessing countries. In a way, I think it may be irresponsible for non-nuclear weapon states to just request and not take substantive actions on their own. Non-nuclear weapon states also have commitments to nuclear disarmament as stated in the NPT Article 6. And so they too must come up with some ideas or measures to set forward the tone for nuclear weapon states to actually move forward towards nuclear disarmament. I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. McKay. If I could turn now to you, Amir. One of the stepping stones covers states' commitments to enhancing the NPT review cycle to improve implementation in all its aspects and to support ongoing efforts to strengthen the NPT review process. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the progress the Malaysian team, as the last PrepCom chair, saw on this and the other stones and commitments related to dialogue and reporting over the course of the NPT review cycle. If I could hand over to you, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you, James, Wilfred, and UNIDIR for organizing this virtual panel discussion. It is certainly an honor to be among distinguished panelists. Let me start by highlighting that my participation today is under national capacity on behalf of Malaysia as one of the NPT states parties and a non-nuclear weapons state. With regard to the question, James, we should begin by acknowledging the Stockholm Initiative, the stepping stones promoted by the 16 countries. We welcome this initiative, just like many other initiatives, as it encourages dialogues and deliberations among states parties in the lead up to the 10th NPT Review Conference. Specifically on the 3rd NPT PrepCom, as one of the states parties, Malaysia recalls the reflections paper issued by the chair. The chair's reflections provided a good snapshot of the positions of countries and the dynamics throughout the NPT PrepCom. Among the points contained in the chair's reflection paper are the following. First, the fact that continued geopolitical challenges underline the need for maintenance and strengthening of the conviction that NPT is the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, that looking beyond 2020 requires reaffirming and implementing past commitments, and this is very much needed to maintain the integrity of the treaty, that a balance between the three pillars of disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses is desired by states parties, mindful of a number of initiatives that have been brought forward during the current review cycle. States parties need to move away from entrenched positions in considering them. Keeping an open mind to new ideas and initiatives is needed to move away from any potential deadlock, and such openness needs to be reciprocated by all states parties. And lastly, open, inclusive, and transparent dialogue needs to continue into the 10th Review Conference and beyond. Civility and diplomacy have also been emphasized and need to be maintained moving forward. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I'll move to the second set of questions that I have, but I can see there are questions that are starting to emerge from the audience in the Q&A. I encourage you to keep those coming, and we will get those. But before that, if I can now start with you, Andre, and there's discussion on possible expansion of measures like New START, and you sort of touched upon this before, but I wonder what would that look like, and should the US, Russia try to bring in, address other sticking points, so issues of non-strategic nuclear weapons? Is expanding this and bringing in countries such as China, is that one of the next steps? What seems feasible to you in terms of moving forward? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So Russia and the US should definitely try to address other potential sticking points. And there are just so many of them. You have missile defense, you have space, you have new types of weapons, even non-strategic nuclear weapons. Because, for example, INF range weapons are non-strategic nuclear weapons, so we'll have to discuss those in one way or the other. We lost almost all the limitations in those spheres. Some of those never had any limitations, so there's a lot of work to do. Russia has proposed an approach to deal with this in like comprehensive manner, to agree on a strategic or security equation which will show how the different things, offensive arms, defensive arms, non-nuclear weapons, impact the strategic stability. And once we have this understanding, then we can go from there and have specific agreements in specific spheres. So now we are waiting for the United States to finalize staffing its agencies and start the consultations and then negotiations. On the other countries, I mean, I wouldn't be against bringing Beijing in, for one thing, because Russia and China together would probably get a better deal from the United States than Russia on its own. But it would also obviously complicate the whole process. And anyway, I don't think this is currently on the cards. And frankly, from where I sit, China isn't the biggest priority. If we were talking about broadening of participation in the arms control process, then Moscow would rather see, for example, Britain, which is US treaty ally, which calls Russia its acute direct threat, and which has just stated is going to increase the number of its nuclear weapons. So the Britain would be much more interesting for Russia to include in arms control agreements. And while we're at it, I also wonder how this deliberate ambiguity, which was just reaffirmed in strategic in the Great Review by the United Kingdom, how does it fit in the P5 process, where we're sort of planning to build mutual understanding of nuclear policies and doctrines, and in a stepping stone, which says nuclear weapon states have to deepen discussions on doctrines and declaratory policies, and it doesn't really fit well with ambiguity, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Tom, if I could turn to you now, and perhaps you'd like to follow up on the response to Andre's remarks as well. And I should also point out that there are questions coming in relation to the change in the UK policy, which I think will also be discussed in the next session. But if I can put the question related to another stepping stone on nuclear weapons reducing or further reducing nuclear arsenals, which seems perhaps to follow on from the points that Andre was making. We've gone from an estimated 70,000 to about 14,000 nuclear weapons, but clearly disarmament progress has stagnated in the last decade. What can we do about that? And I'll hand that to you, Tom.
Well, the good news is the total number of nuclear warheads in the world will continue to decline. The bad news is, so what? What I mean is that both the United States and the Russian Federation possess about 2,000 nuclear warheads that are slated for deactivation. And each of them are deactivating those warheads a couple of hundred per year. So the total number will continue to decline. But that's not what disarmament is about. What we need to address is first the fact that the US and Russia still have about 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons each, and about a total of 4,000 each deployed and in stockpile. Those are the numbers that have to be reduced by a bilateral process that I am optimistic will begin soon. But at the same time, I know how complex it will be, as Moscow and Washington have to go beyond the vocabulary and the relationship they've built over the last many years and talk not just about total numbers of delivery vehicles, but about total numbers of warheads, about alternative delivery vehicles, about the programs undergoing in both countries that do not add to the total of the arsenal, but that do create potentially destabilizing new delivery vehicles. And at the same time, the world has to worry about the fact that as the reduction goes below 13,000, it is important to ask the hard questions about why China and the United Kingdom are increasing the total in their arsenals with, in my view, no justification that they have yet made public. So there's a lot of work to do, and it involves not only Washington and Moscow, but other nations as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I can turn now to Wakana. Many of these stones are really focused on nuclear weapons states, but I wonder what role you think nuclear allied states can play here, and in other stones as well, and how can these sort of states play a role in lessening reliance on nuclear deterrence? I'll hand that over to you, Dr. McKay.
Thanks, Jamie. Also a very great but very challenging set of questions. I believe these questions relate to the first question as well. I think one of the important roles that nuclear allied states should play is to cooperate in setting conditions so that nuclear weapon states can actually move towards nuclear disarmament. More specifically, I think it is important for countries under the nuclear umbrella not to block any movements that nuclear weapon states are considering to take in terms of rethinking or restructuring their nuclear doctrine or nuclear strategy. I'm thinking specifically about, for example, the strong opposition that my country, Japan, showed when the Obama administration was considering the possibility of a non-first use policy. And of course, a lot of oppositions were heard from within the US, but even stronger voices of concerns were raised from allied states. If this non-first use policy would be one of the ways in which nuclear weapon states can show their commitments towards disarmament, kind of a step, then it is the responsibility of the non-nuclear weapon states as well, especially the umbrella states, to accept that change and work together with these countries to reinforce its security alliance with less focus on the role of nuclear weapons. I think it is rather an irony that allied states, which are all fully committed to nuclear disarmament, are the ones that are actually making it harder for nuclear weapon states to move forward towards nuclear disarmament. I understand that it is extremely difficult for these countries like Japan to simply agree on reducing the role of nuclear weapons because it has been embedded in these countries' security policies for decades and decades. So these things cannot be changed within a day or so. Thus, security dialogues amongst countries become extremely important since, as I mentioned in my previous comments, disarmament and security are inseparable, and these two must be thought in parallel. Nuclear allied states should talk more in detail what their security concerns are and how they relate to their reliance on nuclear disarmament. The lack of trust is a serious matter, and confidence building measures become very important in this sense. So both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states should not interfere with one another's efforts on moves towards nuclear disarmament. I think that we need to understand that disarmament is a way to reinforce our security, and thus these two concepts and policies should not contradict nor conflict each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKay. I think there's a couple of points you raised there, which we will return to in the course of the discussion shortly, I think, as well. But if I may, I'd like to turn to you, Amir, now. And it's a question related to the review cycle again. I wonder, how do you think that states can take advantage of the extra time that we have in this review cycle? How can we take advantage of the postponement that we have in the review conference cycle here? I wonder whether you had any thoughts on that. And then I see we have a number of questions in the Q&A which have emerged. I'll start to touch upon these after that. Okay, first, if I could hand the floor to you, Amir.
Well, James, over the course of the last few months, we have witnessed some developments in certain areas. For example, one of the stepping stones focuses on the New START extension, which of course has seen encouraging development. In other words, the geopolitical environment last year was different than the environment of today. At the same time, we could not predict with absolute certainty of how the international security environment will look like by the time the review conference is convened. As we speak, there is a possibility of increase in terms of quantity and quality of nuclear weapons moving forward. With such fluctuating environment, it is vital that we keep the momentum of deliberation among states parties through various initiatives. Of course, we need the important contribution from other stakeholders such as experts, academia, and civil societies. As for Malaysia, together with 16 other states parties, we issued a joint communique in May last year on the 50th anniversary of the NPT. Such initiative was intended to underscore the important juncture that we are currently at in the context of the NPT, looking back at the past and preparing for the future. The virtual panel discussion, such as today, precisely contributes to that goal as we continue to better understand one another. The postponement of the review conference provides both challenges and opportunities. As we speak, countries all over the world continue to face challenging circumstances caused by the pandemic. We, of course, hope for the situation to improve so that our lives could return to the pre-pandemic era. With this universal experience, it gives us an important lesson to look at issues with a new understanding and enlightened perspective. And we realize at some point that extraordinary issues require extraordinary resolve and courage. If such an approach and thinking is shared by all in pursuing the cause of nuclear disarmament, then surely we will be in a good position to make progress when it comes to the 10th Review Conference. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Amir, and let's hope for the enlightened perspective. I have a couple of questions in the Q&A now, which have started to emerge. Two of them are actually directed at Thomas Countryman on the issue of no first use. I'll come to you first, Tom, but then I'll open this out to any of the other panelists if they want to address those questions. So it's around no first use and how can we convince the USA and other nuclear armed states to adopt such policies. Okay, over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you. In January of 2017, I sat in the front row when Vice President Biden gave a speech in which he advocated for the US adopting a policy of sole purpose. That is, the only purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter use of nuclear weapons by others. The question of no first use or an alternative but not exactly identical formulation, sole purpose, is something that has been discussed by Vice President Biden, by candidate Biden, and we should hope soon by President Biden. It is important, and again, I'm hopeful, but I cannot predict at this early point in the administration, that the president will give guidance incorporating a changed US nuclear doctrine to guide the development of the defense budget and the development of a nuclear weapons policy for the administration. It's not easy to do. Dr. Mackay has just noted that it will not be easily understood by allies. But let me say that there is more than one way to approach it. No first use is one formulation, sole purpose is a different formulation. They are close but not identical. I want to refer everyone to an article I've just posted in the chat, which is published in this month's issue of Arms Control Today, the journal of my organization, the Arms Control Association, in which two of the best US experts, George Perkovitz and Pranay Vadi, talk about a formulation that would significantly raise the threshold for consideration of use of nuclear weapons. And that is to say that nuclear weapons use would only be considered if there is no viable alternative to stop an existential threat against the United States or an ally. That would be a significant reformulation that, if adopted by the Biden administration, I think would give an impetus not only to the review conference, but to the prospect of negotiations with Russia and other nuclear weapon states.
Thank you very much. I'd like to extend that question out to anybody else on the floor. Would anybody like to respond? Amir, Wakana, or Andre, do you wish to follow up on that question, point made by Tom? Andre, I think you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly. Yeah, that's quite an interesting approach, and I recommend everybody to read the article. That would actually be very close to where Russia currently stands in its declaratory policy, because Russia would probably not go for the no first use or even sole purpose, but the only caveat it has, it's contemplating using its nuclear weapons when the very existence of the state would be under threat. So imagine enemy tanks rolling in Moscow. So in this case, Russia might contemplate using nuclear weapons for self-defense. It's probably much easier for the United States. There is no realistic scenario under which anyone would be invading the United States. It's just too far from major power centers. But movement in that direction, I think, would be more than welcome.
Thank you, Andre. And anybody else wish to take the floor from? Sorry, Amir, please.
Very quickly, James, Mr. Countryman has eloquently described the complexities on this issue, and we've touched a little bit from the perspective of nuclear weapon states and allies. And of course, we believe any progress in this area will certainly contribute to the wider progress in the context of nuclear disarmament. And we, of course, look forward to continue any further development in the immediate future, and certainly would hope for the best in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. And Wakana, did you wish to take the floor on this point? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would echo my comments that I'm still very concerned about how the Allied states would act when the US actually moves forward. So I think it's up to how the United States and these countries discuss these matters, especially in terms of the alliance system, because nuclear deterrence and the nuclear umbrella is so embedded in the alliance system. I think these countries are a little bit alarmed that the alliance system itself might change if the nuclear doctrine of the United States would change. And so these discussions or negotiations between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states become, I think, very important in this term.
Thank you, Wakana. That sort of point leads to another question which is emerged in the Q&A, which relates to the issue of devaluing and reducing the salience. And I think the point was raised quite bluntly in the Q&A. How do we devalue nuclear weapons? And how do we go about reducing the salience of these weapons? What are the prospects for the US to move, or for other countries to move, even as a unilateral step? Does anybody want to take up that one? And a couple of questions I've started to see. People, please. Sorry, Tom, please go ahead.
when talking about devaluing nuclear weapons, which is the term I prefer, I know that advocates of the Prohibition Treaty seek to delegitimize nuclear weapons. That's one approach. The Stepping Stones Initiative talks about reducing the salience. I think devaluing is the right word. And I choose that word because words matter. Rhetoric matters. For a good 25 years or more, the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states largely avoided talking about nuclear weapons as what made their countries great. That was something reserved for North Korea or sometimes Pakistan, to boast about their national prestige because of the possession of nuclear weapons. That changed first with Vladimir Putin and then with President Xi and President Trump, in which, again, the rhetoric of nuclear weapons as determining great power status was brought back into vogue. I think it's important for national leaders to turn away from that, whether in London or in Washington, and ideally in other nuclear capitals as well. It's not enough, of course, to have only words, as important as they are. What is to be hoped is that a redefinition of US doctrine would also lead to a redefinition of the arsenal. Right now, when China says it has a no first use policy, it has some credibility because it does not have a first strike capability. It has only a second strike capability. If China chooses, as some say it will, to double its arsenal, the credibility of that commitment comes into question. So for Washington or Moscow to make a clearer, more limited statement on nuclear doctrine, it will have an effect at first, but it will only become credible when it is clear that the choices in the defense budget and in the composition of the nuclear arsenal are consistent with the devaluing words uttered by the presidents.
Thank you, Tom, for those comments. Does anybody want to follow up or take on those points? So, Andrew, no, oh, okay. Perhaps Amir, if you want to go first, then I'll hand the floor over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, James, on the specific term devaluing. For my immediate reaction, whatever the chosen term is, I think the ultimate goal is clear, that is nuclear disarmament, and Article 6 of the NPT provides that clear path, and the ultimate goal of total elimination is something that we all should strive for, because we simply cannot afford to live with nuclear weapons, especially with the continuing geopolitical uncertainty, especially on the way forward. And I recognize a point that was made by Dr. Mackay earlier, the element of trust among international community or state parties. So as we use any specific term, I think we also need to be mindful of the impact or perception of the wider community, whether that chosen term will be supporting that process of dialogue, or that term could trigger any perception or perspective of our partners around the table as we continue the discussion. Thank you, Jim.
Andre, please.
So, commenting to what everybody else has already said, there is a specific stepping stone which says nuclear weapon states collectively or individually have to discuss, take practical measures to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their policies and doctrines. The question then is how maybe to achieve that or move in that direction. And something that Dr. Mackay has raised, in order to achieve this, I think you would have to sit down and talk about why do we have the arsenals we currently have and the policies and doctrines we follow, and then try to figure out what has to be changed in order to decrease those arsenals or to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, because it's pretty obvious that if countries believe that all of their weapons and all of their policies and doctrines are what makes them more secure, more safe, then it's hard to imagine they're moving out of it. So finding what the security necessities, and maybe those can be addressed in different ways, I think would be the best way to proceed.
Thank you, Andre. Dr. Mackay, did you wish to take the floor to respond to any points, or should I move to the next set of questions?
I think my colleagues have mentioned what I wanted to say, but I would like to also mention that the stone that Andre just mentioned, the nuclear weapon states to deepen discussions on nuclear doctrine and declaratory policies. I think this part is extremely important when we think about devaluing nuclear weapons, as Mr. Countryman said. It's not just up to the US to think that nuclear weapons should be devalued. I think that if we are going to move forward towards that direction, all of the countries have to think in that term. And it's not just the nuclear weapon states, but also the nuclear possessing states as well that are outside of the NPT. So all of these countries that do possess nuclear weapons need to really sit down and talk about why they actually have these weapons, what are their concerns, what are their security concerns, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this stone becomes extremely important in that sense.
Thank you, Dr. Mackay. If I could follow up on that, I think, and the point made before about words matter, if we're looking at sort of recent developments in doctrine and defining cyber attacks as potentially existential threats, I wonder whether actually there needs to be further reconsideration of that as well. That's perhaps an area where we need to sit down, and there needs to be discussion amongst P5 and all other states as well. I wonder whether anybody wanted to follow up on that point on sort of doctrinal definition and existential threats. Take us on that.
It would be a good discussion to have. You shouldn't expect that it would rapidly lead to an identical description of what is an existential threat. There is no definition accepted globally anymore about what is a security threat. Both China and Russia have developed techniques of causing problems for neighbors and distant adversaries in the gray zone in ways that fall short of military action and that are judged by them to be not so provocative as to require military responses. You would run into similar questions about what is an existential threat. Is a single warhead launched at Moscow or at Washington, if it is taken by the recipient as an effort at decapitation, that might meet the definition of existential threat more readily than tanks rolling up to Red Square. So it does not solve all problems to establish a new standard, but it addresses quite a few of the problems. The necessary co-condition for making this happen is assuring US allies of the US defense commitment. And that's exactly why the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense were in Tokyo yesterday and Seoul today in order to reassure those countries that America's commitment to their security can be met with conventional means and only in the most extreme circumstances, if necessary, with nuclear means. So it is a matter of rebuilding alliance confidence that was so badly degraded during the Trump administration.
Thanks, Tom. I can see a couple of, Andre, you want to respond, and then perhaps Dr. Mackay, you want to respond. Andre, please go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly to what Tom just said, I guess Russia and China would happily take the credit for inventing the gray zone conflicts operation below the war line, but those been there for centuries. Frankly, on how do we fit cyber, and if that could lead to something escalatory. So the doctrines, the nuclear doctrines especially, would always be somewhat ambiguous, and that ambiguity is there by design. That's it's a feature, not a bug. You don't want to say specifically, I will only use this and this and this, but then your enemy could do everything else. That can be seen as an invitation. But all the doctrines have intended ambiguity, but sometimes they have unintended ambiguity. And maybe if you just sit down and our military say, like, okay, so this we can clarify for you. This is not something we put there because we wanted to, put some fog of war, but just we meant this, and maybe it wasn't too clear. That in itself would be really helpful, I believe.
Thank you, Andrei. Dr. Mackay, did you wish to take the floor to follow on from that point, please?
Yes, thank you. I totally agree with what Mr. Countryman just mentioned, that the US is trying multiple times, of course, throughout historically, I think, to reconfirm or tell these allied states that they are fully committed to the alliance system. I think the problem here is that some of the policymakers within these countries, and I'm kind of thinking about Japan, that they are very worried still, even if the US shows certain commitments and sends very important personnel to talk about these issues, they are still very concerned somehow about US commitments. I'm not sure why. But I think this is kind of the fundamental issue that we still have regarding extended nuclear deterrence, and that problem relates to the non-first use or sole purpose issue as well. Another point that I wanted to raise is that how countries consider threat, how countries consider security, and how countries see disarmament, I think differs. So there isn't a kind of how shall I say, a comprehensive understanding of what threat is. I think it differs from countries to country. And so in that sense, I think talking about these issues becomes important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Okay. Amir, did you wish to take the floor at all? Yep, please go ahead, sir.
Very briefly, James, a lot has been covered by other distinguished panelists. Just to touch on the cyber attacks from the context of member states here at the UN, we notice the growing interest of deliberation among member states in talking about cyber attacks. However, we need to manage very carefully the realm of cyber because it still has the benefit of yet to mature compared to the realm of WMD and nuclear. And that is something that all member states, experts, and boards have to think very carefully years down the road, because whatever agreement formulation that we agree today will have an impact 20, 30, 40 years down the road, just like how we are experiencing and witnessing in the context of the NPT and the realm of nuclear. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. I'm conscious of the time and we have a number of questions, but I did want to allow all the panelists an opportunity to raise any points they thought were important, or perhaps there are stepping stones that they see as particular priorities which have not been mentioned, but which could be potentially low-hanging fruit for progress, or indeed are there some which are less feasible. So I'd like to offer all the panelists an opportunity to make any remarks that they have in that regard. I can see, Tom, you've unmuted yourself, so perhaps you want to go first. Go for it.
Sure. I salute the authors of the stepping stones and the foreign ministers who have endorsed it, but it's not enough. It's not enough to call upon the nuclear weapon states to do things. There needs to be an activism among the countries involved in the initiative in several directions. One is direct communication with the new US administration through all channels and through every opportunity of a dialogue with the president or the vice president or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State. Second is to use NATO for this purpose as well. There is a problem in the US bureaucracy that is the diplomats who speak in Geneva are not the same people and may not be saying the same things as the diplomats who speak in the North Atlantic Council in Brussels. And every NATO member, to a greater or lesser extent, has the same problem. If the importance of the NPT and of a different new approach to nuclear doctrine is not discussed in the North Atlantic Council, there will be little incentive for the US or the UK or France to change their doctrines. And third, the stepping stone advocates have to be a bridge between the advocates of the Prohibition Treaty and those who still believe that their security depends upon nuclear deterrence. And they have some good reasons to believe that. It is to be hoped that the United States will tone down the kind of nasty rhetoric towards the Prohibition Treaty that has marked Moscow and Paris and Washington for the last few years. And I expect that to happen. But it's also important that the advocates of the stepping stones help the advocates of the Prohibition Treaty to also tone down their rhetoric and work towards a consensual outcome at the review conference.
Thank you, Tom. There's some considerable food for thought there. If I could turn to Andre, you want to take the floor up, please? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. And again, sorry, disagreeing with Tom again. Frankly, Russia's rhetoric towards the ban treaty and its supporters has been softening for the last couple of years, and since the treaty actually was implemented, was seen as a less of a problem. On maybe the stepping stones, I've already mentioned one, the discuss and take practical measures to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, and another one on nuclear arsenals, and just want to reiterate that in order to move somewhere on this stone, on this stepping stone, you would have to look into why countries have those specific weapons and those specific qualities, and if those can be amended. One of the low-hanging fruits, frankly, in my view, is a stepping stone about improving or establishing crisis communication and protocols among the P5 states. So we have crisis communication between US and Russia. It's based on nuclear risk reduction centers, which are a part of the arms control architecture. There is no reason we couldn't have this with other nuclear weapon states. Now, I don't think it's a political issue. I don't think any of the countries would be strongly opposed to it. So maybe moving in this direction and maybe adding something like exchanging launch information or things of that kind could be helpful and looks like an opportunity.
Thanks, thank you, Andre. I think that's really useful, and that also provides us a bridge to the next session, which will be starting shortly. So thank you for that. If I could offer the floor to Amir and to Wakana, do either of you wish to have any concluding comments from either of you? Amir, please go ahead.
Thank you, James. The ministerial statement of the Stockholm Initiative rightly underlines that past NPT commitments remain valid and form the basis for making further progress in fully implementing the treaty and achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. The ministerial statement also underscores the foundational fact that commitments must be implemented on advancing nuclear disarmament in accordance with Article 6 of the NPT. So without singling out any specific stepping stone, we believe that it is important for states parties to move from the realm of acknowledgement and recognition to the realm of action and implementation. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Amir. And to Dr. Wakana, last word.
Thank you very much. I think one of the important stones and one of the priorities would be on deepening discussions among nuclear weapon states, plus with non-nuclear weapon states as well. And this is not just at the upcoming NPT Review Conference, but having talks constantly would contribute to transparency, which would lead to confidence and trust building, which will contribute to setting the stage for actual nuclear disarmament, I hope. Support towards the CTBT would be one of the practical steps that nuclear weapons could consider taking. A low-hanging fruit for progress would be visits and interaction with communities affected by nuclear weapons, especially by politicians and bureaucrats, people that are deeply involved in shaping foreign policy, as well as security policy plus national security. Also engaging with the younger generations, including dialogue platforms, etc. These are also very important. I know it's very difficult to educate, but I think that is the challenge that we face because we are not going to achieve this goal in 10 years or 20 years, but it would be up to the next generation as well to do this effort together. And so I think this is one of the important stones that the initiative mentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mackay. I think that's a good way to wrap up this panel. I would like to just take this opportunity before handing over to thank all the panelists, so Andrei Batliski, Thomas Countryman, Wakana Mackay, and Amir Hamza Nazir. It's been a really interesting and rich discussion, and I'm very grateful for you all taking the time at various different times to come and join us. Thank you also to the audience for comments and questions. I think that's really fed into the discussion as well. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Wilfred Wan, who will lead the next session. So over to you, Wilfred, and thank you very much to everybody.
Thanks, Jamie. So I'm Wilfred Wan. I'm a researcher with the WMD and other strategic weapons program at UNIDIR. This second session explores the potential for the Stockholm Initiative to address the risk of nuclear conflict, including through risk reduction measures, crisis communication, and greater transparency, as well as other items in the umbrella of confidence and security building measures. Many of the stepping stones, in fact, touch on these. And certainly there's been a lot of positive dialogue around these topics during this review cycle. I've seen this in the context of risk reduction and nuclear disarmaments verification. But we have a very distinguished panel with us today to reflect on their experiences and their perspectives. Just a reminder that the format of this session is also a moderated conversation. After 2 rounds of questions from me, I'll open up the virtual floor to Q&A. And these can be, again, submitted through the Q&A function below in text form. And I'll select and read some of these anonymously. I'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but we can make no guarantees as we have limited time. I should stress that all panelists are here speaking in their personal capacity. So with us, just a quick introduction of our panelists is Ambassador Aidan Little, who is the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the Conference on Disarmament. We have Ambassador Jan Huang, who is the permanent representative of France to the Conference on Disarmament. Nicholas Plattner is the head of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation with the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the FDFA. And we have Elena Sakova, who is the executive director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. So we'll get to it right away. We can recognize the presence of a lot of constructive dialogue across several state-led initiatives and multilateral processes in this NPT review cycle, of which the Stockholm Initiative is one. But certainly there's a need to channel these ideas and processes into concrete outcomes. So my first question is for Ambassador Aidan. There's been a number of discussions in the so-called P5 process, and perhaps we should call it the N5 process in recognition of the Q&A exchange already. But can you talk about some of this work? What are some of the outcomes of this dialogue and what is next?
Thanks, Wilfred. And first, let me thank you for the invitation to speak to this, because it's a really the Stockholm Initiative is a really important initiative, and this set of questions within it is crucial. I mean, we've already talked in the previous panel about the importance of dialogue and understanding. So it's good to spend a bit of time on this. So the P5 process, as it is called, has been called, is all about building trust. That was really the rationale of the P5 process when it was first initiated by the UK under the then Labour government in 2009. It has fluctuated both in the level of structure and formality, but also in the sort of subject matter and the intensity of the discussions over the years. But that thread of building trust and confidence and understanding has really been at the core of it all the way through, and I think, you know, is as we've already been discussing, absolutely indispensable if we're going to make progress to a world without nuclear weapons. I'll pull out a couple of things that we've done so far or have been doing, and I think Jan will probably talk a bit more about what the future holds, and particularly around strategic risk reduction, which is extremely important. But I think I'll just pull out a couple of other points of what's been going on. One is the Glossary of nuclear terms, which has been, I think it's now on its second, we're just about to publish its second phase. It's fairly technical work, but it's been important because it gets the P5 talking, the nuclear weapon states talking. It gets them talking about their different understanding of different terms. Of course, our working language tends to be in English, but of course we use all of these terms in our own native languages in perhaps slightly different ways, and we use the same terms to express different concepts in many cases. So in some ways, the published outcome of the glossary is the easy bit, because that's the stuff we can agree on. The more interesting conversations are actually on the terms that we disagree on, and some of the most valuable discussions have not seen the light of day, but I think have really led to sort of building trust and mutual understanding at that quite technical level, which again, if we're looking forward to some multilateral agreements, is going to be absolutely crucial ground clearing work. The second one I'll point to, which is relevant to the stepping stones, is doctrines. So obviously Stepping Stone 5 talks about this, and we've already discussed this in the first panel, so I won't go into that too much to start with now. Obviously, a lot of this work has to be done bilaterally, and of course the US and Russia have a long history of strategic stability discussions. We hope they are being extended to the US and China. But the P5 process has and can play a very important role in providing a sort of overall context for those more detailed bilateral discussions, but also bringing in those who haven't been involved in those bilateral discussions so far. I would echo what Andre said in the first panel about the importance of deliberate ambiguity. Deliberate ambiguity, in our view, increases strategic stability, precisely for the reasons that Andre said, that it avoids setting out red lines that you can then salami slice up to. But it also, of course, brings room for misunderstanding, and the doctrines discussions that we've had, the very substantive doctrines discussions we've had in the P5 process over the last 2 or 3 years, have really started to get to the core of some of those areas of misunderstanding and potential miscalculation. That's crucial work, and it needs to carry on. But as I say, we've already discussed that, and we can say more about that if necessary. I'll just say briefly about the third area, which is about nuclear weapon-free zones, and step 7 talks about the negative security assurances and nuclear weapon-free zones. Obviously, one of the work strands that we've had in the P5 process for a couple of years now, since the Beijing summit, has been about Beijing conference, has been about the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone, and that's been a useful discussion as well. I think we're hoping we can make more progress on that, but we would like to have more detailed conversations with our ASEAN partners on that. So I think that gives you a bit of a sense of what we've been doing over the past few years as far as it relates to the Stepping Stones initiative. But as I say, this is really all about building trust and confidence amongst the nuclear weapon states, and really there's no prospect of much substantive progress without that. It's difficult, it's painstaking. Some of the conversations are not easy, to say the least. but we have to do it, and we have to stick with it and deepen that as we go forward.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that quite comprehensive overview. I suspect the issue of strategic ambiguity might come up again. But on this point about common understanding, and let me turn now to Ambassador Yan. The French among the P5 has devoted a lot of work to this idea of strategic risk reduction. Can you talk a little bit about this concept? And based on the dialogue so far, do you foresee any potential interim measures that can be adopted to address these kind of strategic risks?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Yes, thank you very much for raising this important issue, which is risk reduction or nuclear risk. Stepping Stones initiative contains I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements related to risk reduction, and I think it's good. The question is now, because given that there is no international definition on risk reduction, and there is ongoing conceptualization work on that important notion through UNIDIR or through other processes, including the Conference on Disarmament. I understand that in the following weeks there will be a debate on that, but there is no real common definition on that. I think the most important is to see whether these elements in Stepping Stones coincide with the understanding from nuclear weapon states on risk reduction, and that is very important. And to give you an indication, I think what we can do first is to refer back to the G7 statement in 2019 in Saint-Malo. It was in April and under the French presidency, and you can see that there is a long para giving a definition on strategic risk reduction. And it's a very precise definition with a lot of elements. And it is not fortuitous that the word strategic was included before risk reductions, because we do think that nuclear risk cannot be comprehended in a vacuum and independently from the new strategic environment. So it is an important things to do first is to see if these two understandings coincide, and I think it is the case. So it is a matter of definition first. It is also a matter of mapping what is existing in this field. What are we doing? What the nuclear weapon states are doing in terms of nuclear risk reductions, in terms of strategic risk reductions. And this mapping exercise has to be done because we are not starting from scratch. There's a lot of things which has been done. And I think that coming to the NPT, it will be important that the REFCON will acknowledge these important measures that we have taken among the nuclear weapon states. But it's also a matter of prioritization, because at a certain point, we need to have a sort of consensus of what is the most topical issues in terms of mitigating certain type of risk in this very complicated geographical and strategic context. So what are we doing in the P5? Because it was your question, Wilfried. We are first working on these three aspects: definition, mapping, and prioritization. And secondly, what we are doing is trying to identify potential elements for an operational conclusions for the REFCON. And it's what the international community is expecting from the P5. And when I say operational conclusions, I think the big challenge is to identify direct security benefits that the international community can draw from this discussion, from strategic risk reductions in the NPT context. Now, very, very quickly, to give you the French perspective on that, because it was also the start of your question. On risk reduction, I think there's three elements on which we can deepen our thought. First is confidence building. It's what really Aidan said before me. P5 dialogue, doctrines, glossary is not something insignificant. On the contrary, mapping multilateral and bilateral risk reduction agreements, etc. Second element, how to increase understanding and comprehension. And it's really much, the question is how to make sure that nuclear doctrines, which is based on ambiguity, should not lead towards misperception and miscalculation. This is an important element. And the third element is to how to improve effective crisis management and prevention tools. So as I said at the beginning, there is a certain number of tools that we have available, but the question is it enough? Do we need to make more? Is it some loopholes that we need to fill? And that's the question that on which we are working on, and on which France wants to have more progress. Thank you very much, Wilfried. Thanks.
Thanks, Ambassador, for identifying these areas. Certainly, risk reduction is one of my favorite topics. And turning now to Nicholas, and speaking of prioritization, quite a few of the stepping stones do link to different aspects of that topic, from its strategic aspects to issues like entanglement, crisis management, and broader risk awareness and dialogue. Switzerland has been quite active on this subject. What do you think are the areas that appear ripe for movement or further exploration? And what should states and other stakeholders prioritize?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. First of all, let me thank you, Wilfried and UNIDIR, for the organization of this event. And also I would like to thank Sweden and Germany for an exemplary leadership in the Stockholm Initiative. Indeed, the initiative represents an opportunity to dialogue across topics, groups, and we are convinced that it can make a positive contribution. The very idea of Stockholm Initiative is to advance disarmament, to improve security, and to develop a concrete proposal that should be acceptable to all in the view of making progress at the REFCON. And as you said, risk reduction stands as a promising candidate, and it is also mentioned in the Berlin Declaration. I quote, "No, it's time to take action to reduce nuclear risk." A lot of the stepping stones are related to nuclear risk reduction. We count about half of them directly or indirectly. And to your question about what measures are ripe, the low-hanging fruit, you can take the very first one of the stepping stone. And I quote again, nuclear weapons states should acknowledge the need to ensure that a nuclear weapon will never be used again and to advance nuclear disarmament. This is the declaratory nature that was just mentioned by Tom Countryman earlier in the previous session. We believe that we need a collective statement like that at the REFCON in the outcome document to express the deep concern that we have about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of those weapons, to mention that it is in the interest of humanity as a whole that those weapons are not used again. And this could take the shape in one way or another of the famous 1985 statement, of course, adapted to today's reality. And finally, the REFCON should acknowledge that reducing risk of use of nuclear weapons is in the interest of humanity as a whole and in line with the NPT objective and purpose. In the current context, with the doomsday clock still at 100 minutes to midnight, it would be really incomprehensible that the conference cannot agree on such a clear signal. Another area where the REFCON could make or could trigger specific progress, it would be, for instance, to call on the P5 to take specific step on nuclear risk. For instance, expand their work in this area, place nuclear risk reduction as a standard agenda items of their P5 meeting or N5 meeting, depending, and establish working groups dealing with things like policies and doctrine. Happy that it takes place already. Another issue would be new technologies, look at the risk drivers, and also look at how technology can actually contribute to reduce risk, and also consider risk of miscalculation, misperception, and accidental use. And in that context, to make an example, and it was also mentioned many times already, there is the issue of establishment of a hotline system. Certain systems do exist between certain possessor states, but we believe that this could be expanded. Switzerland, for instance, intends to cooperate with a leading nuclear risk reduction expert, John Gower, and the Institute for Security and Technology to work on a project called Catalink to establish a simple, secure, and powerful communication system between head of states to be used in case of crisis. And finally, a final point, a third area that we believe is ripe for the NPT RevCon is to establish a process focused on nuclear risk reduction. We believe that it should become a standing item in the NPT review cycle to allow for structured, outcome-oriented, and inclusive discussion. Establishing a process to ensure that the NPT can take stocks of what has been done and what can be done, and be informed about decisions that could come in the future. Of course, that's a few suggestions. There are many other possibilities that can be done that nuclear weapon states can explore, unilaterally, multilaterally, etc. Rethink the importance of nuclear weapons in their security doctrines, put on ice, reverse certain capability or modernization efforts that are taking place, and re-examine and adapt doctrines and posture under the prism of risk reduction. And in that particular light, I am obliged to make a reference to yesterday's publication of the UK Integrated Review of Security. It is, I think, quite significant that the buildup that has been announced is a significant shift in our view, and inconsistent with what we heard from the UK in the past regarding nuclear arsenal and the understanding of its obligation under the Article 6 of the NPT. And more serious in our view is the UK's decision to go for nuclear ambiguity. It seems that to imply, and I'm happy to hear Ambassador Liddell, it seems to imply that leaving behind its previous understanding of the value of transparency to foster a stable relationship among nuclear power. And for us, it doesn't necessarily make the world much safer. I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. The issue of the integrated review has come up in the question and answer, and we'll be sure to get Ambassador Aiden's thoughts on some of that in a bit. But for now, thank you for laying out the very concrete list of potential risk reduction options. First, Elena, turning to perhaps another potential area of promise and a subject of another of the stones. A number of states have unilateral moratoria on the production of fissile materials. And it seems that there's some space for multilateral movements that could have significant value from a from a signaling perspective. Where might this space lie? What are the challenges? And how might these be overcome? Elena, you have the floor.
Thank you, Wilfred. It seems like I've got one of the questions that may have actually be one of these lower hanging fruits, at least. I think it's a little bit, I'm a little bit more optimistic of what could be done in the area of dealing with fissile materials. Although, as every almost other area, nothing is easy. But I would say this is one of the areas where the fruit is really ripe. First of all, United Kingdom, the United States, France, and Russia stopped their respective production of nuclear materials for weapons purposes at the end of the Cold War, in some cases even earlier. China is believed to have stopped the production in the late 80s as well. However, there have been no official policy declaration on stopping the production from China. From a signaling standpoint, a joint declaration from the 5 nuclear weapon states confirming that they no longer produce such material or do not intend to produce it would be certainly welcome. But at least in case of China, that is something that it could do unilaterally and use it as a momentum to reach out to other P5 states. And I'm saying China because China has been recently a country where some of the concerns are raised regarding its potential buildup of the nuclear arsenal. I think it would alleviate some of these concerns, if not fully, but at least to some degree. But I want the nuclear weapon states to go much further than just reconfirming the status quo in terms of the production of materials, particularly if they want to convince other countries to join, including India and Pakistan, in stopping the production of materials. I think what they should focus on as the next step is to address the existing stockpiles of excess materials from weapons programs. Some progress in this area has been done in the late 90s, early 2000s, particularly in the US-Russia context. But we know that the HEU LEU downblending program has been exhausted at this point. New commitments were not taken on. The US still has not finalized its own HEU downblending commitments of materials coming from weapons programs. Plutonium disposition agreement between the US and Russia is now defunct practically. So first, what they should do is to deliver on these promises. But secondly, they could declare additional excess stocks that they have and commit to downblend or dispose of them in some other manner. I would also like to see, in addition to that, their commitment to take these excess materials and place it under the IAEA safeguards. This will make these withdrawals verifiable and irreversible. And we have talked about it many years ago, and it's still on the agenda. First of all, there was a US-Russia IAEA trilateral initiative that laid the groundwork, including technical solutions for such verification and a model safeguards agreement that would have been developed to facilitate that. This initiative stopped in 2002. None of the nuclear weapon states seized this opportunity and placed any of their excess material withdrawn from their military and programs under the IAEA safeguards under that model agreement. I think maybe the UK would be the first one to do take such undertaking. It declared over 4 metric tons of plutonium as excess to military requirements. Maybe one of the steps to kind of redeem the recent announcement. So that's one possibility. I think the other important issue is the transparency of stocks. We know that except for the United States and the United Kingdom, other nuclear weapon states have not published their reports on the HEU and plutonium stocks. It's an important transparency measure, and it's something that has been also dragging on in the NPT Review Conference final documents. And I would say the last kind of point here is that when we started discussing the fissile material stocks, their transparency, including the fissile material cutoff treaty and others, we were in a different era. Now we also face threat of nuclear terrorism. And the steps that can be taken even further to what I've said is to stop and declare the intent of producing new materials for weapon purposes, to put the additional materials out of the military domain, and other measures, transparency measures. They all contribute to many of these cross-cutting issues: non-proliferation, arms control, disarmament, and nuclear security. And that is also a stepping stone and building block for the fissile material cutoff treaty. But maybe we could discuss it later because I want us to continue the discussion. Thank you, Wilfred.
Thank you, Elena, and I appreciate your point about kind of how intertwined all of these issues are, and I think it's quite reflected in the stones as well. We can recognize that some of these issues, including fissile materials, have been on the NPT agenda for quite a while now. The Stockholm Initiative, I think, also highlights the importance of the tone of dialogue, of improving this environment, including through expanded engagement. Before we turn it over to the Q&A, and just a reminder to please submit your questions in text down at the bottom on your Zoom toolbar, I want to explore this kind of idea of process a little bit more with our panelists with a second set of questions. So accordingly, first back to Ambassador Aden. And this came up a little bit in the first session as well, but the stepping stones do mention the role of other nuclear weapon possessors, for instance, in risk reduction. And there's always been some concern about legitimizing the nuclear status of these non-NPT nuclear armed states. How does the P5 weigh this? You know, how can nuclear weapon states effectively engage these states?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a perennial and tricky question, but it's a really important one. So I think the first thing to sort of pull out is that two of the steps explicitly talk about the non-NPT possessing states. That's number 9, which is about the structured dialogue on nuclear risks, and number 14, which is about showing leadership on the fissile material issue. But there are others which refer to all states. It's not clear to me whether that's intended to mean all NPT states or all states, you know, full stop, including the states outside the NPT. But actually, you know, when you're talking about the CTBT, for example, or the fissile material moratorium that we've just been talking about, or verification, or some of the others, you know, they are relevant, of course, to the non-NPT states as well. So it'd be interesting to sort of hear from the drafters whether that was deliberate or what that was meant. But certainly, as I say, the two that sort of explicitly refer to the non-NPT possessor states are really important. So I suppose that the first thing to say is perhaps just to sort of pick up very briefly on the fissile material point, because you know that has been one of the sticking points in the CD. One is, as Elena says, that China is the only one of the nuclear weapon states that hasn't declared a moratorium, and I think its interest in a fissile material cutoff treaty has waned over the years, if I can put it politely. But you know, the ostensible block in the CD is Pakistan, which refuses to allow negotiations to begin on the basis of the Shannon Mandate. So you know, if we want to make progress on a fissile material cutoff treaty, and that has to be done in the CD, there's no alternative venue, then of course we have to engage on that question with the non-NPT states. That's evident. But I think that the risk reduction one is the most interesting one in a way, because I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the integrated review, but the integrated review that we published yesterday talks explicitly about this. It says that the UK will champion strategic risk reduction and seek to create dialogue amongst states possessing nuclear weapons and between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. And this is explicitly talking about all possessor states. This is because two of the most dangerous areas of nuclear risk in our view are South Asia and North Korea, obviously, which are outside the NPT. And so it's clear that if we're going to reduce nuclear risk as it exists in the world, we have to do that in those two areas. And the nuclear weapon states, because of their experience in this area, I think have a very important role to play. Now, the difficulty is that, for very good reasons, the NPT nuclear weapon states have been reluctant to engage as a group with the non-NPT possessor states, precisely because we don't want to convey that sort of legitimacy on their possessor status. But equally, you know, we understand the real world risks, and it's in everybody's interest to try and engage with that pragmatically. So I think that is a difficult one, but it's really vital that we make progress on that. While we're talking about the UK, by the way, one of the initiatives that we've been supporting over the last couple of years is BASIC's work on nuclear responsibilities. And that work is explicitly engaging with the possessor states outside the NPT as well. They had really good discussions, as I understand it, in New Delhi and Islamabad on this. So that's one way in which we can have those conversations, perhaps in a slightly less sensitive way. The last point I'll make on this, of course, this is not just about nuclear, because nuclear risks don't just depend on nuclear; they also depend on things like cyber and on space. So, you know, there are other ways in which we can approach that nuclear risk or the strategic risk reduction question, which doesn't sort of cut across that sensibility on the NPT. You know, we can do it through the discussions on cyber, and we can do it through discussions, as we hope, on responsible behavior in outer space. And they, of course, will involve some of those states which are important actors in those fields as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Speaking of kind of nuclear aspects and turning over to Ambassador Jan, I think there's been quite a lot of interest from non-nuclear weapon states during this review cycle on these topics that we've talked about. Can you talk about some of the engagement with these states, whether from a French perspective, a P5 perspective, or a NATO perspective? Are there ways in which this engagement can be strengthened? You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, that's an important question, and I really appreciate this question. If you see the past NPT outcome documents, it is absolutely clear that progress has indeed fallen short of our expectations. That's absolutely clear. But it doesn't mean that these elements are all irrelevant now. It's exactly the opposite, and we need to be sure that the conversation and the deliberation will continue on that different elements. And I'm very glad that Elena focused a purpose on fissile material, because it's a real important issue. FMCT is not, it's not a logical way to make progress towards nuclear disarmament. It's a technical imperative for nuclear disarmament. A nuclear disarmament cannot and will never occur without cessation of fissile material production. And FMCT remains an important, of course, topic for which we need to keep pressure on. The entry into force of the CTBT is absolutely important. We should not neglect that this important aspect, because it's a logical continuation of nuclear disarmament. And when you end the quantitative production of nuclear weapons, you need to be sure that qualitative production will be halted as well. So CTBT, FMCT is a conversation that we need to prolong, but there's also some other issues for which we need to see if if we can strengthen or engagement. And we have just talked on risk reduction, so I won't not elaborate on that. But nuclear verification is a promising avenue, I think. And this is something on which we need to deepen our reflection. On that particular point, you see that there was a lot of unprecedented field exercises conducted. I just have in mind the Franco-German exercise under New Dive. So this is something that that deserves a debate within the NPT. And maybe last thing, that we should not omit is transparency, of course. There is a need to enhance transparencies in many ways, at a certain limit, of course, because we need to, of course, to make sure that transparency will not contradict with proliferation concerns. And this is a topic for which we have engaged with NPDI, for example, who has given a certain number of proposals for which we need to have a close look. Thank you very much, Wilfried.
Thank you, Ambassador. And since you brought up the CTBT and the FMCT, maybe I'll turn to Elena first and then go back to Nicholas to wrap up the second round. But Elena, progress towards ratification of the CTBT and negotiation of the FMCT are subjects of two of the stones. Are there ways in which confidence building measures around these topics can push states to a more constructive place or dialogue around these, and what might these be?
Thank you, Wilfred. The question sort of implies that we are not likely to see progress on either of the two treaties in the near term, which is obviously disappointing, but I would agree with that kind of implied assessment. But what could be done in the meantime to build some confidence, to create some trust and some momentum for moving forward? I would say with respect to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, they're one of the often suggested way forward is for the nuclear weapon states to confirm their moratorium on testing, and that they do not intend to test, and that they are fully supporting the treaty and its entry into force. I think given the recent developments, it's probably the most important to hear it from the United States and China, because they are the two countries from the Annex 2 who are preventing the entry into force and have not ratified the treaty. They should confirm their commitment to a moratorium and on testing and adhere to the non-testing norm, which is indeed, I consider, the already existing norm, absent the entry into force. I think in the US case, it's also very important to signal that the Trump administration attempts to revive testing, at least posing that question, is not on the agenda of the new administration in Washington. That we've heard it before the elections from the candidate Biden, that he finds Trump's administration announcements as irresponsible, but we should hear now from the administration. Now it's in the White House. One thing that I want to note here is, like, when we talk about the possibility of who goes first in terms of ratifying and reaching the entry into force of the CTBT, we always talk about the domino effect. What if the US ratifies, then the China will follow, and then the others, and so forth. I want to flip the question and look, what about the domino effect? Is one of the countries that actually signed, maybe not yet ratified the treaty, would do a testing? What kind of effect that would send? And whether we will open the huge Pandora box. I think in terms of bringing the other nuclear possessor states in India and Pakistan, I think countries should use the opportunity of reaching the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the CTBT, which is in September of this year, and have a 7-party statement on moratoria and adherence to the non-testing norm. I think that would be a welcome development. Obviously, there are many questions are surrounded around the zero yield question when we talk about the nuclear testing. for safety, reliability, and others. This is a thorny issue in particular US-Russia context, but also recently with China context as well. And it's important to take this ambiguity out of the debate. If Russia is interested in the entry into force and US adherence, the unequivocal statement that reconfirms zero yield should be relatively easy to get the P5 to agree on. Well, I'm saying relatively easy. I'm not suggesting that any of these steps is easy, but I think that that is something that they should be able to confirm. It also may help if we hear that reinstatement that zero yields may help with their ratification in the US Congress in the future. There may be some confidence building measures, including former test sites. This certainly could be discussed. Some of this could be developed and be, say, contingent of the US, for example, joining, ratifying the treaty, and China in this case. There are many other suggestions that could be done, but what's important in the meantime to support the international monitoring system and the international data center and the entire verification system of the CTBT. Many countries that are not have yet opened their territories for stationing some of these verification stations, IMS parts of it, could do so. That would be also welcome. And the financial support would also be extremely important, particularly in the COVID, post-COVID, or still continuing COVID phase. I already spoke a little bit about FMCT in my initial remarks. What I wanted to say that what we have already in place, we had two important groups. High-level fissile material cutoff treaty expert preparatory group produced excellent report. The group of governmental experts produced excellent report as well. In terms of preparation for the process, we have plenty of it done. And we have many other initiatives who could contribute it. But what we do probably could do in the meantime is the link in our head, the negotiations and the technical side of it, and do some practical steps that can move us forward towards down the lane and reinvigorate the process. I already described some of them in my initial remarks. In addition, I think that few things could be done. For example, some additional transparency and confidence building measures, such as looking at the dismantled or decommissioned fissile material production facility, say for the example, in the United Kingdom or in France. They could be like test beds for discussing how these facilities were dismantled, possible declarations, future inspections process, and so forth. This could have a demonstration effect and also engage these experts and governments. I think one of the key points here that we need to have communication going about among experts and scientists and diplomats, at least some kind of to gel that lacking trust and actually falling out of having to talk to each other. But I'll stop it here.
Thank you, Elena. And that I think that point on trust is certainly well taken. I do want to get to the Q&A. So the last question for Nicholas actually ties into one of the questions that has already been raised in the Q&A, which is basically about the role of non-nuclear weapon states in the context of risk reduction, right? Basically, how do you think non-nuclear weapons can best contribute to these issues in the context of the Stockholm Initiative and beyond? And how has Switzerland gone about it? And I know you already talked about a lot of these ideas in your first answer. So whatever aspects of that you want to tackle, please feel free. You have the floor, Nicholas.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that we believe that, of course, nuclear weapon states bear the primary responsibility when it comes to risk reduction. They're also the best place to advance nuclear disarmament, which we know complete elimination of nuclear weapons is the best way to eliminate nuclear risk. That said, non-nuclear weapon states have also a role to play, and perhaps let me put two elements on the table. First, nationally, they can make contribution to improve global and regional security, avoid misunderstanding, work on the environment, etc., contribute and participate in transparency and confidence building measure like the Hague Code of Conduct, for instance, on missile and ballistic missiles. That would be the first element. And second, non-nuclear weapon states can do a lot of things, call nuclear risk reduction the call of the day, so insist on the importance of progress in that area. They can highlight again and again the catastrophic humanitarian consequences related to the use of nuclear weapon. It is, after all, a very powerful driver when we talk about nuclear risk reduction. They can also support non-proliferation and disarmament education. And finally, they can be active in relevant discussion. For instance, CND, so Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament Initiative, has a working group on nuclear risk reduction. What have we done nationally, so Switzerland, to move forward? Well, we support think tanks, for instance, and also UNIDIR to do research on that. We have declared that a priority for the next RevCon. This is in line, of course, of our historical engagement. I mentioned the alerting resolution. We're also champion of the ST agenda on risk reduction. And concretely, we are going to push for a nuclear risk reduction package. And we believe that the Stockholm Initiative is a solid vehicle to do that, because it is a committed and geographically representative group of countries. And it has anchored nuclear risk reduction firmly in the Berlin Declaration. And finally, of course, we also intend to enter in a discussion with the nuclear weapon state on that proposal to hopefully make progress at the RevCon. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Turning to other questions that have been raised so far, and I think it'd be remiss of me not to kind of touch on this. Ambassador Aden, the issue of the integrated review has come up a few times, and certainly a number of concerns have been raised, including in relation to stockpile numbers, issues of transparency, ambiguity, etc. And this has been raised by several participants as well. And I was just wondering, what does this document mean for UK policy, especially in the context of efforts to reduce the role of nuclear weapons moving forward?
Thanks. I'm glad you asked me that, Wilfred. So look, a lot's been said over the last 24 hours about the UK's announcement on nuclear, and I think it's important to put this in some context. First of all, I think anyone who's attended nuclear non-proliferation treaty conferences or the first committee over the last 3, 5, 10 years has got used to everybody saying the security situation is getting worse. I think we all agree on that. So, you know, it's important, and the integrated review is also very clear on how and why we think that's the case. So I think that's an important first point. The second point is that the UK's nuclear doctrine is basically the same as it was the day before yesterday. So we have what we call the minimum credible deterrent posture. Our nuclear deterrent is its task is to deter the most extreme threats to the security of the UK and its allies. It's there to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. That's a constant with what it was before. The minimum credible deterrent it relies on a single delivery system, which has been the case since the early 90s. Those weapons at sea are de-alerted and de-targeted, as they have been since the mid-90s. The minimum credible posture has been our posture again, I think, since the 90s. We have always been clear, though, that minimum credible deterrence involves deterrence at the minimum number to be credible. So, as Tom said in the first session, actually the number itself is not the point. The point is what is your posture, and we can talk about, as I say, Tom talked about doctrines and delivery vehicles. Well, our delivery vehicles have been the same for delivery systems have been the same for 20, 30 years. That's not the case with all. We are not building novel and contentious systems. We're not developing nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missiles. We're not developing nuclear-powered autonomous underwater drones and all this sort of thing. We're not developing a nuclear triad. So, you know, there is a lot of continuity in that. What has changed is that we now believe that the minimum credible deterrent cannot be delivered within the pre-existing cap, which was 225 warheads. That was a cap, not a target. The new cap, not a target, is 260. That's an increase of about 15%. So, you know, this is a recalibration of what stockpile we think is needed to be credible, given the range of threats that we discern. And again, the integrated review talks about that, talks about the sort of nuclear risks that we perceive. They're not only about capabilities, they're also about doctrines. And again, that comes back to Tom's point. This is as much about what we see others signaling as the capabilities that they're developing and whether they're compatible with their own doctrines or not. So I think what I would say is that you know, the stockpile decision should be read in a much wider context, and really this is a continuation of the UK's fundamental nuclear doctrine as it's persisted for the last 30 years. It's a recalibration of what we think minimum credible deterrence means in the current security environment, but it doesn't negate all of those steps that we've already taken. Our nuclear weapons stockpile at its height was something close to 500 weapons. It's now, you know, as I say, it will not go above 260, but that's not a target. We may not even need that many in the years to come. So I would emphasize the continuity really, whilst making no apology for reassessing the security environment. As for transparency, because that's come up, I mean, we are still, I think, one of the most transparent nuclear weapon states, despite having the smallest arsenal, even now, of the 5 nuclear weapon states. Different states have different views about what that means and what they can say and what they can't say, and some things we don't talk about, others do. But we've also talked in the previous panel about the importance of deliberate ambiguity, and we think deliberate ambiguity, a measure of deliberate ambiguity, improves strategic stability. Now, we've always maintained that in terms of the exact nuclear threshold, and again, we repeat that language in our IR this time, and that's been the case for 20 years or more. But we have decided to extend that because that gives us greater flexibility within that overall stockpile number to calibrate according to the situation. So we think extending that policy of strategic of deliberate ambiguity improves strategic stability, and that's the reason we've done it. If we didn't think it would, we wouldn't have done it. So I think it's important to say that as well. I don't want to hijack this discussion because we're here to talk about the Stockholm Initiative, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to make those points.
Thank you, Ambassador Aden, and I appreciate your willingness to tackle this. I suspect there will be plenty of discussion on this moving forward, and you'll hear from plenty of skeptics as well. And certainly, I think these issues will be part and parcel of the NPT Review Conference and, of course, the Stockholm Initiative. I'm going to have to apologize to the other panelists, but we are going to have to close this session to stick on time. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. At this point, I do want to hand over now to Ann-Sofie Nielsen, the Ambassador for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation of Sweden, for some closing remarks. Ambassador Ann-Sofie, thank you so much for joining us today. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and I hope you hear me well. First of all, I also, of course, want to thank UNIDIR for hosting today's event and for a very rich discussion, and also thank presenters and colleagues for, for very good ideas and advice on how we can move forward with the Stockholm Initiative ahead of the upcoming NPT RevCon. As you said, I've been entrusted to give some concluding remarks. I will not try to summarize the discussion, but I will actually go back to the lens of the Stockholm Initiative on Nuclear Disarmament and the stepping stones, where we come from and where we want to move together with other states parties. First, let me underline again that the next NPT Review Conference will really provide an opportunity not to be missed for an outcome that strengthens the treaty, and thus it strengthens global security. We will all benefit from that, and it will certainly provide an important political message for multilateralism, but also that international disarmament and non-proliferation regime remains fundamentally robust. But confidence very much lies confidence in the treaty very much lies in the fact that we implement commitments and obligation. It has been mentioned by others, but I still want to go back to 95, but of course 2000, the 13 steps, 2010, the 64-point action plans on that from that review conference, they remain valid and they form the basis for making further progress in fully implementing the treaty with a goal to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. It's just very important to always have this on top of our minds. And today we have had an opportunity, and I think it's been really interesting, to discuss a number of areas that can be part of this implementation agenda. They include, as we have discussed, the role of nuclear weapons in security policies, in doctrines, nuclear risk and risk reduction, where Switzerland, as has been, as you spelled out very well, Nicholas, you are part of the initiative, but you have also developed ideas and this topic further, which I think is, we're very grateful for this. Cooperation and building trust, strengthening the nuclear arms control architecture, upholding existing moratoria on nuclear weapons testing, and of course, CTBT, fissile materials, reporting and reviewing has been discussed. But with the stepping stones, these are also part of the Stockholm Initiative stepping stones. But in addition, the stepping stone approach also offers an action-oriented method of taking steps that would move us in the right direction and set in motion what we also have been discussed, confidence building processes. Very, very important part of our diplomacy here. And I think it can help breaking down different items into more digestible measures and provide for implementation of them, and thus allow for progress also in the current security situation. So it's about these 22 stepping stones, but it's also about the approach that I wanted to highlight at the end of today, which is pragmatic in its view that on exact which steps that can be taken, but very firm in our conviction that they can be taken and they should be taken. And this is something that we want to discuss further. The 22 stepping stones, and I should also say that there are more of them than have been. We've had a discussion on a number of them today, but you know them well, and there are more that we haven't had time to go into. But they should still not be seen as an exhaustive list or a full wish list. But what they should be seen as in our joint discussion is that they are really what we see as realistic and honest suggestions for matters and measures that we could deliver on and that we could take on now. And of course, nuclear weapon states bear a special responsibility. And we want them to seriously look upon these stepping stones, use the approach and the method, and continue this dialogue that we have had already today, further on, deepening it. What is possible? What is acceptable? How can we move forward together? And I also want to say that we believe it's important that also non-nuclear weapon states are part of this dialogue and part of this agenda, as we have been today. Let me also say that it is not about setting the bar low. On the contrary, and this full range of proposed stepping stones, they really constitute what we see as a realistic and an ambitious package that we want to move upon. And we think that it's really time to implement the commitments, and this is proposing a way to do it. I also want to say, I know there is little time, but we want to work with other initiatives, with other actors, other groups, so that we can move together, because there's a lot of synergies there. We are not, as some said, it's not an easy discussion. We are not all in agreement, but there are also synergies that we can move upon. And by this, I want to finalize by saying that, as Robert said in the beginning, we have transformed these stepping stones to a working paper ahead of the conference, and we are inviting states to align with this document and the 22 stepping stones. And we hope that we together can be part of this building of a way forward, and that we can provide a method and some concrete input to the RevCon itself when we will meet in that conference. I stop there. I thank you all, and I think it's time to hand over to you, Wilfred. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ann-Sofi. It's certainly been a very unique NPT review cycle, but I think it's a very positive sign. There's so much constructive dialogue around some of these topics we've talked about in the context of the stepping stones and the Stockholm Initiative. And hopefully states can build on that up to the review conference and beyond. We'd like to conclude this event by expressing our thanks to all of the panelists and speakers today. Thanks also to the UNIDIR team that put this event together, especially Leticia Sarkan as our producer, and also recognize our incoming colleague, Maria Garzón Maceda. Thank you to you, the audience, for joining us for this event. You'll receive an email from the UNIDIR team requesting your feedback. Alternatively, you can complete this now through the instructions in the chat window. If I can encourage all of you to fill in the form, this will help us improve events moving forward. So thanks again to all. Please take care, have a good rest of your day, and see you soon.